I'm an author, editor, and educator, and I'm here today with my co-host, the Rad Reverend, Timothy Radcliffe.
Hello.
The Rad Reverend is a pastor, he's a doctoral student, and a voracious reader of good books, which is why we're here. So Rad Reads is a relaxed podcast where we discuss good books that we're visiting. Nothing is off the table, so we will spend time on all sorts of books, classics, history, theologies, as well as sci-fi and fantasy, which is kind of our wheelhouse.
Yeah.
We also have a special interest in indie books, so authors and books that often fly under the radar, but they're excellent, and we want to highlight the best books for you that you likely won't find you just like at the bookstore. So, and then the last thing that we're going to do, finally, a few of our episodes will be exclusive read-alouds of my stories that I've written. So that's going to be A Time to Embrace, which is a gender-bent Little Mermaid retelling. We have the Periapsis Press stories, Grandpa Got Ran Over by a Reindeer, and Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, which are liminal space horrors with demon fighting and Christmas magic. And then I also have a thriller in space called The Canaan Project. So we'll be recording a couple of those live for you. So back to introductions. Timothy, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do and what you like to read and why?
Sure. Well, you've already mentioned I'm a pastor and a doctoral student. I'm going back for a doctorate, studying church revitalization, how to help churches be restarted or come back from the brink of closing. So the majority of things that I end up reading are related to that, to my work and to my school. So I read a lot of books of theology. I read a lot of books of church history, and I read a lot of books on Christian living and how to help people live as Christians. When I get time to then sometimes read for pleasure, what I typically end up reading is I read a lot of history and I read a lot of fantasy. Is the primary things that I end up reading when I'm reading on my own. And I find that I enjoy history. I enjoy reading it. I enjoy reading fiction, and I enjoy reading fantasy. And so it's not often that I get time to just sit and read for pleasure, but when I do, those are kind of the areas that I live in.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about how the things that you read outside of, maybe theological works, how does that inform your preaching and your teaching in the church?
Yeah, one of the things that has been really clear and actually was told to me when I was young and just getting started in ministry and pastoral ministry was that I should read broadly. I shouldn't just read Christian books, but I should read more broadly than that, because there's a lot that the world has to teach us, and there's a lot that people know about or are reading on their own that I need to be aware of. And so that kind of started with history. Where did we come from? What's going on now in our world? And we all know the phrase, right? Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to be aware of the missteps and some of the things that people have done in the past that have not worked and have not been good ideas, and how we can learn from that and how we can move forward from that. So history, I think, is a really important thing for especially pastors, but really for all people to read, because it's going to inform us. How did we get here? And what are the mistakes and missteps that we can learn from the past that we can avoid now? So it really does get from just learning about what happened in the past. It gets into how we actually should live. And that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about as a pastor, is helping people see how they should live and being able to take real life examples and say, this is how it turned out for them. So how could we do something maybe a little bit differently? And then you asked, how does fiction relate to that? I actually find that some of the people that I quote the most in my teaching is Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, in large part because their style of writing, right? They are writing for a purpose, and yeah, we can look at them and we can talk about the literary genius of those men, and it's there. I'm not denying that at all. I love it. But one of the things that they are really intentional about doing is they're talking about, kind of the way that the world is, maybe the problems that the world is facing, but also how that should be corrected, and how the way that the world is now ought to be. And so they use the building blocks, they use the guidelines of fantasy and fiction, and fairy story. They
Yeah.
use that to actually teach people what they should be doing, and kind of how the world is supposed to be. And so I find myself going to those kind of important pillars of fiction. I find myself going to them a lot to kind of find new or interesting ways of explaining to people the way the world is, and really the way that we think that it should be.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. When you look at their stories as, in a sense, these broader redemption stories, right? It
That's right.
makes it easy to talk about, make those comparisons, make those bridges when we look at the story of the Bible. And the story of the Bible is the story of redemption. So we get to see that mirrored in fiction, these little
Yes.
creators mirroring the
Yes.
great creator. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I mean, that's what Tolkien is all about, right? And when that one day, looking forward to that far country where one day everything sad will be untrue.
Mhm.
That's the whole point of his writing, is that there is beauty, there is truth, and though we can't see it now because of the corruption of the world, that is where we are headed, and we are headed to that time when everything sad will be untrue. And so if you are reading his books in that way, you're reading his stories in that way, that
Mhm.
there is a God, a creator who is at work, who is working to redeem the world. I think you miss a lot if you don't see that.
Yeah.
But when you see that, it's very easy to take then his stories and bring them in, and talk to people in the church about that story of redemption.
Oh, and just as an aside, because I know the answer to this, how many times have you listened to slash read the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy?
So I have physically read my copy of Lord of the Rings about 8 times. I have read it on my own several times. When I was in high school, I started reading it every year. And then as I got older and things got a little busier, I didn't read it every year, but I've read it in its entirety to my daughter. I'm now reading it again to my son. So I've read it about 8 times, and I'm working on my ninth time. And then I also listened to it. Robert Inglis's audiobook
Yeah.
recording of the Lord of the Rings is wonderful. I've listened to it over a dozen times in its entirety. So I've read the book or listened to the book over 20 times.
I'm gonna try to think of the amount of hours that is.
Yeah. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time that I have spent with the Lord of the Rings.
Awesome, awesome. Oh, and as an aside to that, so I did see
Yeah.
recently a post on X about somebody was saying how like kids aren't gonna today won't like the Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson's trilogy because they can't identify with it. And what do you say to that?
I mean, there's a lot that can be said about that. One is it is a wonderful epic retelling of the Lord of the Rings in the stories if you watch the extended editions. Um, but there's something that yeah, is going to be lacking in them, because it does lack a little bit of the soul of writing. And I think that when you read the books, it is easier to be in the world. That's part of the problem that a lot of people have with reading Lord of the Rings, is they find it hard to start because so much of the book is just about living in the world.
Mhm.
And I think that, though, it does a disservice to children when we say they can't possibly understand what it's like to live in a make-believe world. Like, no, children are really good at understanding what it's like to live in a make-believe world. And so depending on how young your child is, yeah, it might be hard for them to live in that world and understand that world at times. But as they grow, it's easy for children to understand the world of make-believe, and to
Mhm.
be able to point out characters and say, hey, isn't this character great? Isn't it wonderful how he always does the right thing?
Mhm.
That's a wonderful opportunity for children, I think. So yeah, there's a lot of different directions that you can go with Lord of the Rings, and you want to be careful. You don't want to, I've had people say, oh, it's too boring, I can't get into it. And I said, I think that's because you haven't stayed with it long enough.
Yeah.
Stay in the world and let it grow. And as you see the work of redemption being done, it grows on you to the point where when it's done, you don't want it to be done.
Mhm.
When Sam says, well, I'm back, you go, that can't be the end, if you live in that world long enough.
So good. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
But yeah, transition now to what are you currently reading, and what's your latest rad
Yeah.
read?
Yeah, I go through seasons and periods of time where sometimes what I'm reading is dictated for me. Being a student means that I have professors that say, "Here's 10 books that you have to read by next month." So I've just recently finished reading a whole section of books on church revitalization and church leadership. But once that was done, I started to have some time to read for myself. I'm in the middle of listening to the audiobook version of Titan, which is Ron Chernow's history of John D. Rockefeller. And so I know there's discussion and debate, and we'll probably actually talk about this at some
Absolutely.
point. But there's discussion about whether audiobooks are real reading or not. But I find that I can't get through 1,000-page books because I don't have the time to do it
Right.
on my own at home. But I can listen to them, and so I've been listening to this book. It's been really interesting because I don't really know anything about John Rockefeller. I don't really know anything about the oil
Mhm.
business. I'm not a businessman. I don't know anything about business in general. So why would I pick up this book? It's really because I love reading history, and I find that once I start reading about an interesting person or an interesting series of events, I get invested just because it's interesting.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, I picked this one up because there's a lot of conversation right now in our world, the world that we live in, 21st century America, a lot of discussion about should people be super wealthy? What do
Right.
we do with people that are super wealthy and have all this wealth, and how should they live, and what should they do? So I kind of picked this book up, just kind of thinking, I guess
Mhm.
this is kind of contemporary for our times, and so I picked it up and started reading it, and I've really enjoyed reading this book about John D. Rockefeller.
Good. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, and I do think it's very relevant. And I think you had mentioned too when you were reading it, that Rockefeller's more complex than I think a lot of history typically
Yeah.
paints him, right?
Yeah, it's, I mean, as with any person, we don't want to be judged just by one thing that we've done in life. And even if it's a good thing that we have done in life, we don't want to only be known for one thing. And
Right.
so, you look at John D. Rockefeller, and you just think of his money, you think of his business practices, or you think of his philanthropic works. But most people think of one of those things about him. And
Yeah.
Ron Chernow did a really good job of showing the person of John D. Rockefeller. And yeah, there's some things that he did in business that were pretty cutthroat, pretty ruthless. But he also was involved in church. He was a committed
Mhm.
Baptist, and he taught. I mean, he taught Sunday school from his late teens all the way until he was not physically able to teach Sunday school again. Never missed
Wow.
church. And was always telling other people about the Bible, teaching people, and he was involved in donating to charity and philanthropy his whole life, but he didn't become known for it until later on, because for so many years he had just done it anonymously as something that he thought was the right thing to do. And people started complaining that he wasn't giving away money. And so it's only after that he starts to
Yeah.
become known and put his name on things that had already been doing for years. And so, as with most people, there's a lot more nuance with John D. Rockefeller as a person than we often hear. And so it's just interesting to kind of see that people can be really strong in one area, really strong businessmen, and maybe even go over the line in some
Mhm.
areas. But that doesn't mean that that's all that they are as a person. And so,
Right.
kind of reading through that and kind of seeing that, I mean, he's given more money away and gave more to charity and more to schools and more to medical research than any other individual in human
Hmm.
history. And
Hmm.
so it's hard to see that. How do you deal with somebody who is cutthroat in business, super wealthy, but also the person who's done more than any other individual in history to educate and to heal? It's more nuanced than maybe we
Mhm.
give him credit for.
Yeah. Well, it sounds
Yeah.
like a great book. So awesome
Yeah,
read.
I've loved it. I encourage you to pick it up if you have time. It's a little bit older now, 30 years old now, but
Oh, okay.
still worth a read. So, all right, we've been talking a lot about me though, and this is not actually my podcast. This is really your podcast, even though I'm helping out with it. So, probably time that we introduce you. You've mentioned you are an author, you are an editor, you're an educator.
Yeah.
So, how about we talk a little bit more about that? What is it that you do?
So I do a lot of things. Right, like you said, I'm an author, so I've written a number of books. in sci-fi and fantasy and other speculative genres. So my main series is the Almness Chronicles. It's a young adult dystopian fantasy series, and I've written 3 books in that. I'm working on book 4. I've also recently written it's an adult high seas adventure fantasy, but it's clean, and that one's called the Tower of Cortico. So that's more of a sweeping epic fantasy. And then I've also written a number of short stories, and I mentioned some of them earlier. Some of them more thriller, horror, and then also some more traditional fantasy. So that is what I write. And I've also do write a little bit of nonfiction. I've written a biography on Corey ten Boom, and that kind of leads into my other job as an editor. I'm the managing editor of a magazine called Christian History Magazine. So I spend a lot of time in history as well. So I'm reading articles by historians who are experts in their fields a lot of times. So I get to learn all about all different aspects of church history as my job. And then I help their stories get a little bit more interesting. I help them tell those stories a little bit better. And then finally, I am an educator. I am a homeschooling mom. So I teach my children at home, and I also do teach courses for other homeschooled children. Particularly, I am interested in teaching middle school and high school. I've done literature and creative writing with both of them, and that's been a lot of fun. If you've spent any time with teens, they're a really cool age group because they are still so interested in learning. You can still surprise them with stuff, and they're so much more open, and they're willing to tell you what they think about stuff. And I really enjoyed that aspect of teaching.
So you're involved in a lot. You have a lot of different things that you are doing, that you're involved in. What genres do you find yourself kind of gravitating toward to write, and how do you kind of keep those things straight? How do you stay in the genre, or how do you blend them together? So what genres do you write in, and how do you kind of navigate those different genres?
Yeah. So typically I'm writing fiction, fantasy. It's kind of like my main sort of wheelhouse, but I do kind of, like I said, spread out into different things, sci-fi and fantasy together. So you see that in my Almness Chronicles series, which is more of it's a dystopian fantasy. So you have these various elements. And then also I do work a lot of like horror elements into my work, which you've read, so you've seen it. And keeping that straight, it is difficult. You really do have to switch gears. So if I'm editing nonfiction articles for a history magazine, turning around and writing fantasy, it could be like a little bit of a headspace. But what I have found is the real life stories that I read help inform the worlds that I'm building. They give me inspiration and fodder for interesting stuff that I can build into even just like the background of my world. Or like if I'm writing about a people group, I can say, here are some dynamics that I've learned from history that I can introduce into this people group that I might have not known previously, because we typically read only about our history, right? We only read about American history. So it's nice to read about the rest of the world and find different ways to build that in and make your cultures and the worlds that you're writing about even richer.
Yeah. Well, staying kind of on that topic of genres, what are your favorite genres to read, and why do you think that you find those genres to be so interesting to read about?
Mm-hmm. So I think my favorite genres to be reading would probably be high fantasy, or more like mythic fantasy. So along the lines like C.S. Lewis was a huge influence growing up on disappearing into his stories, but being able to see, like we had mentioned previously, the overarching kind of theme of redemption, of that there's a good thing that we're looking forward to at the end of this, kind of messy story or whatever. So yeah, really influenced by C.S. Lewis. I've also got more influenced by different writers as I grew as a reader and I went to college, and one of them was Flannery O'Connor. She's a Southern Gothic writer, and so a little bit, it's much more literary, but the kind of horror elements that really kind of stuck with me and influenced my later work.
All right. Well, since I know the answer to this already, I'll use that as a transition. So, hearing what you like to read, what is your latest rad read?
Right. So along those lines, I just finally picked up the novel Wise Blood by Flannery O'Connor. So, like I said, I read a lot of Flannery O'Connor, but I read primarily her short stories. So she has a large collection of short stories. And Wise Blood was her first novel, which I never read before. And I'm not sure if I love it or I hate it.
Ah.
It's it mirrors the trajectory of a lot of her short stories, in which you have these kind of unredeemable characters that you learn about. You can empathize with them, but you also kind of hate them.
Mm.
And then they have this moment of catharsis as the climax point, but it's their redemption coming about in a very violent way. And that is kind of, I think, Flannery O'Connor's MO in her writing. Well,
Yeah.
she does this in Wise Blood, but it's a longer story. And there's a lot more of it, so it's not quite as distilled into this one short snippet, but you have multiple degenerate characters. So many of them seem unredeemable. The novel itself is about a character named Hazel Motes. He's a World War II vet. He comes back from the war and has nothing left, and he decides, because of that, he's going to start the Church of God without Christ. So that's the name of it. He wants to become. He wants to start this church because he's been marked by his life by this kind of people keep misidentifying him as a preacher, because his grandfather was a preacher. Like, multiple times in the novel, people say, you have a preacher's face, you look like a preacher. And he's trying to escape this identity, and he's also trying to throw off this Christianity that's dogging him, this very real, visceral Jesus Christ, who's the ragged figure in the shadows, is what he's identified in the book. But throughout the story, he's going to all these great lengths to shed Christ and start a church without Christ, and say, this is actually the truth. And you see multiple characters interacting with him in ways that they're also just equally as degenerate, but just in different ways. And it gets wild. Somebody steals a mummy at one point and brings it to him to become the new Jesus. There's a guy who kills a man in a gorilla suit. There's a lot going on. So so I'm like, one of the reasons that I'm not sure if I love it or I hate it is because so much of what happened, I was like, I don't even understand what's going on and why. But the reason I might love it is because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it. So I've been looking at those particular scenes and I'm like, what is happening? And I'm thinking about them all day long. And I'm like, okay, so this is a story that's making me think, making me try to consider, what was Flannery O'Connor trying to do in this story? So
Yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because just because we don't necessarily like a book or identify ourselves in that story, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad book. It can still be a good book, because now we're sitting with it, now we're thinking about it, and maybe the mark of a good book is something that you can't get out of your head. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yep. So we'll leave you guys with that. So if you have not read Wise Blood or Titan, we'd say pick that up, and tell us in the comments or write us and let us know what books we should be reading. We're always looking for good books. What's a rad read that we should know about, or what's a topic you want to hear more about? We already mentioned, we'll probably talk about, is listening to audiobooks reading. That's a good topic, which I'd like to explore. So you can comment, send me an email at KaylinaRadcliffeWrites@gmail.com. But until then, this concludes our first episode of Rad Reads. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, and remember, read rad things.